Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we break down complex historical and theological sources into essential, actionable knowledge.
Today we're undertaking a fascinating study of theological history, and we're drawing upon the really rigorous framework laid out by Jonathan Edwards in his examination of the work of redemption.
Right.
We are looking at a specific crucial era that, it's often overshadowed by the larger movements of the Bible.
That's right. Our source material focuses on that pivotal 2,000 years that bridges the great figures of the Old Testament. We're talking about the era from the calling of Abraham up to the time of Moses. It might seem like a quiet, almost domestic period, focused on just 4 generations, but Edwards reveals that this was perhaps the most crucial preparatory phase for the entire national and theological structure of Israel.
Precisely. The mission of this deep dive is to understand how God proactively advanced his saving work during this long, kind of quiet period. We'll see how he upheld the true religion against really overwhelming odds.
And how he physically separated and prepared the nation that would bear the Messiah.
Yes, and fundamentally laid the essential groundwork for Christ's arrival.
Edwards outlines 9 distinct ways the work of redemption moved forward in these years. For you, the listener, the takeaway here is clarity. It's an understanding of how God not only established the structure of the church as a separate entity, but also confirmed his saving promise, the covenant of grace, in increasingly specific and graphic ways.
We begin our exploration with the drastic measures God took just to keep the true faith from vanishing off the face of the earth.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at the world Abraham was called out of.
When God first intervened in Abraham's life, the spiritual atmosphere was gone to reality. It was catastrophic. I think we often forget that the state of the post-flood world had reverted almost entirely to apostasy.
Right.
Idolatries were rampant. It was threatening to smother the single candle of true faith that had been passed down through the line of Shem.
So this wasn't just, a bit of creeping paganism. This was systemic failure. Our sources suggest that without divine intervention, the true knowledge of God would have been completely extinct within a generation or 2.
Oh, absolutely.
And that context really explains the absolute necessity of God's call.
It does. And we must pinpoint the geographical and cultural center of this apostasy. Abraham was called out of Ur of the Chaldees, the country around Babel, which is the historical and religious seat of idolatry.
Babel, as in the Tower of Babel.
The very same. This is where the descendants of Noah, after the flood, attempted to establish a centralized, anti-God kingdom, symbolized by that tower.
So Ur of the Chaldees wasn't just a wicked place. It was the original chief seat of idol worship from which this spiritual infection spread globally. It's no wonder Scripture speaks so strongly against that land.
Indeed. The prophet Jeremiah, referencing this region long after Abraham, calls Chaldea the land of graven images. And he notes that the people are mad upon their idols. This detail clarifies the extreme nature of the environment Abraham was removed from. It was the source, not just the symptom, of worldwide spiritual corruption.
So God calls Abraham out of this epicenter. But what I find really fascinating in Edwards' analysis is the recognition that God chose an entirely new method of preservation compared to what he had done before.
This is a key distinction that shows the progression of redemptive history.
Right.
If we look at the period before the flood, the strategy God used was, it was integration followed by destruction.
Okay.
The true church, the sons of God, intermingled with the wicked world, and the result of that was total corruption. So the solution was the catastrophic destruction of the entire world, saving only the church and the ark.
But now, here we are again, the world is corrupt again, but God doesn't repeat the flood. He makes a strategic shift in how he deals with sin and preservation.
The method shifts from universal, immediate judgment to physical and legal separation. God instructs Abraham to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house and settle in a far distant land, Canaan.
And this is the subtle but vital detail, right?
It is. When Abraham arrived, God did not give him a permanent, settled inheritance. He gave him no possession. No, not so much as to set his foot on.
He's a sojourner, a stranger. He lived in tents. That lack of permanent connection, that chosen vulnerability, that seems to be the very mechanism of separation.
It creates an immediate, visible wall. Abraham's posterity would be strangers, living distinct from the Canaanites, who were becoming rapidly wicked. This ensured that the true faith would be upheld by a people legally and geographically separate from the overwhelming flood of heathenism. It was a strategy of insulation, really, rather than annihilation.
And this act of physical separation has these massive theological ramifications. It positions Abraham as the new starting point for the visible church.
Absolutely. Edwards argues the calling of Abraham is the laying of a new foundation for the visible church. He's establishing it in a much more distinct, formal, and regular state than ever before. It's why Abraham is consistently represented in the New Testament as the father of all who believe.
He becomes the root from which everything else grows.
He is the root from which the entire visible church grows as a tree, fundamentally distinct from all other plants and nations. This is vital because this root later produced the Redeemer, Christ, who is repeatedly called the branch of righteousness.
So the separation isn't just about protection. It's about preparation. You can't have the covenant, the types, and the specific prophecies without a dedicated vessel, this distinct tree.
Correct. This distinct national structure, initiated by Abraham's calling, was necessary to receive the types and prophecies of Christ, to commit the divine oracles to a specific group, and crucially, so that when the time was right, the Son of God could be born of this specific separated nation, shining the light of the gospel to the rest of the world. The whole structure of election and sovereign grace is visible in this first separation.
Okay, now that the foundation is laid and the Holy Seat is separated, the second great way the work of redemption advanced was through the expansion and, more importantly, the sealing of the covenant of grace itself. Separation was just the prerequisite.
This is where the theological light dramatically increases. We have had two prior solemn confirmations of the saving promise. The first was to Adam, the second was to Noah. Edward sees the Abrahamic covenant as the third edition, progressively clearer and marked by repeated divine oaths.
So what did Abraham learn about the Redeemer that Adam and Noah didn't possess? How did the light intensify here?
Well, the promise became profoundly particular. To Adam, the promise was simply the seed of the woman.
Right, very general.
Very general. To Noah, it was about general preservation. But to Abraham, it was revealed first that Christ would be specifically of his seed. This narrowed the focus from all humanity down to one patriarch's line.
And crucially, at the same time, the scope of salvation was simultaneously expanded.
Yes, the calling of the Gentiles was made much clearer than ever before. The promise was not just for Abraham's descendants, but that all the families of the earth should be blessed in him. The universality of the gospel, that Christ is for the whole world, is enshrined right here in the promise to Abraham, and it's repeated multiple times to ensure its absolute certainty.
This also appears to be the moment the actual condition of salvation is brought into sharp focus. Edwards argues that the covenant of grace is defined by its great condition.
Faith.
That is the pivotal doctrinal moment. In Genesis chapter 15, after Abraham is promised a multitude of descendants, the narrative states, Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness.
A statement cited extensively by Paul.
Right. It shows that salvation has always been by grace through faith, even long before the law of Moses.
Abraham becomes the paradigm. He is declared righteous based on trust in God's saving promise. This is why he is called the father of believers.
Precisely. It is essential for the doctrine of redemption that the condition of saving faith be explicitly displayed prior to the giving of the law. Abraham's justification confirms that God's method of saving people has always been singular and rooted in belief, not works.
But the covenant wasn't just spoken. It was sealed with multiple dramatic pledges. Let's start with the institutional seal that physically marked his descendants. Circumcision. Circumcision was instituted as the seal of the covenant of grace in Genesis 17. The Apostle Paul later analyzes it, arguing it was a seal of the righteousness of faith. So what it did was confirm that the spiritual benefits, the righteousness counted by faith, belonged to Abraham and his posterity.
So beyond that spiritual sign, how did circumcision function as a physical instrument of preservation and separation, as Edwards sees it?
It served as the primary physical wall. It was a defining rite that immediately made Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, distinct from every other nation on earth. It was a continuous generational reminder that they belonged to the covenant, defining the perimeter of the church until Christ, the substance of the covenant, arrived.
Let's move from the personal seal to something more spectacular, almost geopolitical. Abraham's victory over Chedorlaomer and the allied kings. Why does Edwards treat this military skirmish as such a profound prophetic moment?
Because of the scale of the threat. Chedorlaomer was no local bandit. He appears to be a major imperial figure reigning from Elam hundreds of miles away. Historians often connect his empire to the early Assyrian or Babylonian power structure, possibly originating from the line of Nimrod at Babel, the original anti-God power. For this seemingly massive imperial force, which ruled Canaan, to be utterly subdued by Abraham and a small band of 318 trained household servants, well, it's purely miraculous.
So it's not just a victory, it's a defeat of the world's organized anti-church authority.
Exactly. God gave Abraham this victory as a tangible pledge, an earnest of the eventual greater victory that Christ, the ultimate seed, would obtain over all the anti-Christian nations of the earth, over sin, and over spiritual enemies. Isaiah later refers to this triumph as foreshadowing the church's ultimate conquest. It's a guarantee written in blood and battle.
And then, immediately following this military triumph, we get the mysterious confirmation from Melchisedec. This figure is so central to later theology, yet he just appears so fleetingly here.
Melchizedek is a king of Salem, the king of peace, and a priest of the Most High God. Edwards highlights him as a preeminent type of Christ because he combines the kingly and priestly offices outside of the future Levitical system.
I see.
This shows that the original true priesthood predates and supersedes Aaron's lineage, proving the covenant was never meant to be confined to one earthly, temporary system.
And what about the bread and wine he offered? What's the significance there?
Melchizedek met Abraham with bread and wine, which Edwards argues signifies the spiritual blessings of the covenant of grace. Since Abraham had already received the seal of entrance circumcision, which corresponds to baptism, he was now given the blessing equivalent to the Lord's Supper, confirming the covenant right in the moment of his victory. This connects Abraham's successful battle back to God's grace, not his own strength.
The promises continue to be confirmed in more abstract symbolic ways, too, like the vision described in Genesis 15 with the sacrifice and the passing symbols. That sequence is critical.
It is dense with redemptive meaning. It lays out the precise pattern of Christ's work. Abraham prepared the sacrifice and fell into a deep sleep. As he watched, two symbols passed between the divided pieces of the animal.
First came the smoking furnace.
The smoking furnace, symbolizing darkness, distress, and fire, represented the intense sufferings of Christ, his humiliation, agony, and death. But what followed the furnace is the entire message of hope.
The burning lamp.
The burning lamp shining with clear, bright light passed through second. This signified the glorious exaltation that would follow Christ's sufferings, his resurrection, ascension, and ultimate reign. This vision confirmed the entire sequence. Humiliation must precede glory, and the glory is secured by the suffering. The entire plan of atonement was revealed symbolically to Abraham.
And perhaps the most personal and difficult pledge Abraham received concerned Isaac, his miraculous birth in old age, followed by the command for his near sacrifice.
The birth itself confirmed the specific line through which the Messiah would come, reinforcing Abraham's faith. But the sparing of Isaac on Mount Moriah is the most visual, tangible type of the resurrection.
I understand it's a type of Christ's sacrifice, but why specifically the resurrection?
Because Abraham acted on the belief that God was able to raise Isaac even from the dead, as the book of Hebrews confirms. When Isaac was laid upon the altar, Abraham reckoned him as good as dead. When God provided the substitute ram, Isaac was returned to Abraham, representing the deliverance of Christ from the grave. This event served as such a powerful personal confirmation of the promise that God renewed the covenant on that specific mountain at that precise moment. It was a guarantee of ultimate life through apparent death.
So with all these accumulating confirmations, seals, types, visions, what was the ultimate spiritual condition of Abraham? How much did he really understand?
The light was sufficient for true, saving understanding. The sources confirm that Abraham had a distinct, saving view of the Redeemer and the future works that would be accomplished. We know this because Christ himself declared in John chapter 8, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." The era of general promise was over. This was the era of detailed, assured hope.
We're going to move now to the third advancement, which deals with physical rather than spiritual preservation. After sealing the covenant, God had to ensure the physical line, the holy seed, wasn't simply exterminated by the wicked world they were separated from.
Yes, and this preservation of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was precarious. They were the very vessels carrying the promise, the route from which Christ would proceed. Yet, they were few in number, strangers dwelling in a land whose inhabitants were extremely wicked, even if, as Scripture says, their iniquity was not yet full.
And their very presence must have been a condemnation of the surrounding culture.
It was a constant source of spiritual friction. The ancient enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent was made manifest. When you have men like Lot vexing his righteous soul and preaching righteousness in Sodom, they naturally provoked hostility. As strangers, they were vulnerable to outrage and violence, as Lot experienced before Sodom's destruction.
Yet, Psalm 105 beautifully summarizes their protection. It says, God suffered no man to do them wrong and reproved kings for their sakes. This wasn't just passive safety. It was active, targeted divine intervention.
Indeed. We see this preserving mercy in really high-stakes situations. Think about the crisis caused by Simeon and Levi's bloody revenge against the Shechemites.
Right?
That act of violence should have triggered a retaliatory war that would have wiped out Jacob's small family entirely. They were militarily powerless against the surrounding tribes.
But the scripture says the terror of God was placed upon the surrounding cities.
This is a remarkable instance of sovereign grace acting through sheer dread. The surrounding people, who had every reason and opportunity to pursue and destroy Jacob's family, were struck with a supernatural, paralyzing fear. The terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. The survival of the Messianic line hinged entirely on this singular act of divine psychological intervention.
We see similar intervention protecting Jacob from his own kinsmen who sought to harm him.
Yes, Laban, pursuing Jacob in a rage, was stopped by a divine rebuke commanded not to speak to Jacob either good or bad. And perhaps most dramatically, before the confrontation with Esau, who was approaching with a small army intending violence, Jacob wrestled with Christ at Penuel.
And after that encounter,
God miraculously turned Esau's heart from murderous intent to tender reconciliation. This fragile root, holding the future of redemption, was preserved by a series of supernatural acts against military, familial, and tribal threats.
the survival of the church was like keeping the ark afloat in the middle of a storm. It was only by the hand of God. This leads us directly to the fourth advancement, the awesome destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. How did this calamity advance redemption?
It promoted the great design in two distinct but related ways. The first is immediate and practical. It acted as a powerful deterrent to the neighbors of the patriarchs.
The destruction occurred immediately after the grievous abuse of Lot and the angels who were sheltered under his roof.
Exactly. This public, highly visible judgment by fire and brimstone struck massive dread into the minds of the other inhabitants of Canaan. It was a very clear lesson. Abuse these holy strangers, and you risk incurring a similar, instant, and terrifying judgment. This memory, this fear, reinforced the terror of God that later protected Jacob's family.
So, the destruction was part of the divine preservation mechanism. But the second way is theological, dealing with the economy of salvation itself. It provides a dramatic exhibition of the terrors of God's law.
Right. The work of redemption requires that humanity be sensible of their guilt and their need for mercy. The law must act as a schoolmaster to drive men to Christ. Since the clarity of hell and the future state was less defined before the coming of the gospel, God often used external, awful, physical manifestations of his wrath against sin to teach this lesson.
The memory of the flood was fading. Humanity needed a renewed, fresh warning.
They did. The destruction of Sodom served to renew the display of God's wrath against ungodliness in a most terrifying manner. Edwards specifically points out that this destruction by fire and brimstone was the liveliest image of hell that had ever been witnessed on earth up to that point.
This makes sense of the Apostle Jude's reference to them as suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. It wasn't just a historical event, it was a visible illustration of the eternal reality.
It displays the absolute severity of God's wrath against sin, illustrating the infinite debt owed under the law. This deep awareness of the curse of the law is absolutely necessary to highlight the necessity and the incredible value of redeeming mercy. Thus, judgment, in this case, paradoxically advanced the work of redemption by preparing the human heart for the gospel.
As the church was preserved and the terror of the law was established, the covenant continued to be refined, which leads us to the fifth advancement. The continuous, specific renewal of the covenant of grace through Isaac and Jacob.
The promise, which began with Abraham, had to be narrowed to ensure the purity of the messianic lineage. God renewed the promise to Isaac, confirming that the oath sworn to Abraham would be fulfilled in his seed, who would multiply greatly, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed.
And that selection immediately excludes Ishmael.
Immediately. And then the covenant narrows again, excluding Esau and focusing entirely on Jacob, who is Israel. Jacob receives the promises first through his father Isaac's prophetic blessing.
But then he receives personal direct confirmation.
Yes. At Bethel, fleeing Esau, he saw the vision of the ladder reaching from earth to heaven, a powerful type of Christ, the only mediator and means of communication between God and humanity. The covenant was renewed right there.
And Jacob rested on a stone, which our sources suggest is another powerful type of the Redeemer.
That stone was later anointed with oil, confirming its symbolic nature as the anointed stone of Israel, representing Christ, who is the only true altar and the foundation stone of the church. The covenant renewal here confirmed that Jacob's seed would spread everywhere, guaranteeing the widespread blessing of the gospel.
But Jacob needed further personal assurance before facing his enraged brother. That leads us to Penuel.
Penuel is where Jacob wrestled with Christ himself, who appeared in a pre-incarnate physical form. The act of wrestling and prevailing was not a test of physical strength, but a spiritual confirmation of the covenant's certainty. By wrestling with the divine, Jacob received a powerful, intimate assurance of God's presence and faithfulness, which was essential for him to face his imminent crisis with Esau.
This brings us to the sixth advancement, a massive historical event that serves as a powerful type of Christ's work. God preserving the family from famine by sending Joseph to Egypt.
This was a pivotal moment of providence. A devastating famine threatened to starve out the entire nascent nation. God orchestrated events, the hatred and jealousy of Joseph's brothers, to send Joseph ahead into Egypt to provide for the entire family. As Joseph himself recognized, God meant it unto good to save much people alive.
And Edward stresses that Joseph's life is not just a story of preservation, but a striking, detailed prefigurement or type of Christ's saving work.
The parallels they're too numerous to ignore. Joseph, a kinsman and a brother, saved the house of Israel from perishing by famine. Christ, our kinsman, saves the spiritual Israel from eternal spiritual famine.
Okay.
Joseph was a brother who was hated, sold, and almost killed. Christ is the one whom we, through our sin, hate, sell, and ultimately slay.
And the pattern of humiliation leading to exaltation is perfectly mirrored.
Joseph endured deep humiliation, being betrayed, sold into servitude, falsely accused, and cast into a dungeon, which acts as a powerful parallel to Christ, appearing in the form of a servant and descending into the grave.
But his subsequent exaltation follows precisely.
It does. He is raised to Pharaoh's right hand as the deputy ruler, reigning over the entire kingdom and dispensing life food to his estranged brethren.
And crucially, he dispenses life to the very ones who had hated and sold him.
Which is the core message of redemption. Christ, exalted to the right hand of God as Prince and Savior, dispenses the gifts of the Spirit and eternal life to those who were his enemies and who betrayed him. Joseph's story provides a historical, practical guarantee that the sequence of redemption suffering leading to sovereign rule and the salvation of enemies is God's determined pattern.
This pattern is then focused further in the seventh advancement, the ultimate narrowing of the promise through Jacob's dying blessing of his sons.
The pedigree of the Redeemer is narrowed for the third time. First to Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and now, out of the 12 sons, the Messiah is confined to the posterity of Judah. This is the origin of Christ's title, the Lion of the tribe of Judah.
Jacob's blessing paints Judah as a warrior and a leader. Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. But the blessing adds a crucial detail concerning the timing of Christ's coming.
This is one of the most specific prophetic statements given up to this time. Genesis 49:9 states, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be."
The presence of governmental judicial authority within the tribe of Judah must endure continuously until the Messiah, Shiloh, arrives. What exactly does the term Shiloh convey in this context?
Shiloh is generally interpreted as the one who brings peace or rest, or perhaps he to whom it belongs, the rightful ruler. The revolutionary aspect here, however, is the geopolitical clock.
A geopolitical clock, I like that.
The prophecy links the coming of the Redeemer to a very specific, diminishing political reality. When the tribal and national authority of Judah starts to dissolve, when the right of the tribe to execute its own governance departs, that is the signal that the great king Shiloh is about to arrive.
And that same promise concerning Shiloh also clarifies the Gentile calling even further than before.
Yes. The phrase, "Unto him shall the gathering of the people be," is a crystal clear statement that the nations, the Gentiles, will be drawn to him. The light of the gospel, which started as a vague spark to Adam, is now shining brightly, focusing the messianic line and defining the political and spiritual context of his advent thousands of years in advance.
We're now moving into the final stage of this era, what we're calling the Egyptian crucible, which covers the 8th and 9th advancements. The family is in Egypt. They're safe from famine, but now they're facing existential threats of a different order.
In the 8th point, the power of Egypt becomes systematically engaged not just in oppression, but in the calculated destruction of the Holy Seed. The Israelites, living in Goshen, fell under Pharaoh's complete authority.
And Pharaoh's campaign was meticulously structured for genocide.
It was. First, he attempted to weaken them through hard, debilitating bondage, hoping to curb their reproduction and morale. When that failed and they multiplied even faster, he escalated to an absolute effort to extirpate their race entirely by commanding the midwives to drown every male child born to the Hebrews.
And if the males were destroyed, the nation would effectively vanish within a generation, and the promised lineage of Judah would be obliterated. The vulnerability was total, yet the outcome was the reverse of Pharaoh's intent.
That is the miraculous element. Edwards views this as a profound demonstration of God's sovereign control over the powers of tyranny. Not only were the Israelites preserved despite comprehensive efforts to annihilate them, but they multiplied exceedingly. The very attempts to destroy them resulted in a massive demographic explosion, ensuring they would leave Egypt as a distinct, numerous nation rather than a handful of extended family members.
So the physical seed was preserved, even amplified. But the 9th advancement addresses a threat that Edwards considered arguably more catastrophic, the spiritual peril they faced while in Egypt.
The church was always most vulnerable when it was surrounded by pervasive paganism without proper spiritual defenses. Being long among the Egyptians, serving as slaves for centuries, they lost many of the advantages of the true religion. They had no public worship, no centralized teaching, and critically, no written word to anchor their faith.
And the inevitable result of being surrounded by Egyptian heathenism.
The sources, specifically the Book of Ezekiel, indicate that the greater part of Israel borrowed heavily from Egyptian idolatry. They fell away to the worship of the idols of Egypt. The theological framework was dissolving under the weight of foreign superstition.
And this represents the 3rd time the visible church was almost swallowed up by the world's wickedness. It parallels the crisis before the flood and the crisis before Abraham's call.
It demonstrates the constant, terrifying fragility of the visible church when left to its own devices amidst rampant sin. The true faith does not persist naturally. It requires sovereign preservation.
So how is the true church preserved in this total darkness?
It was preserved like the ark in the flood, only by God's determined will. While the masses adopted idolatry, the true religion was still upheld by a faithful remnant. We know, for example, of the faith of Moses' parents who defied Pharaoh, and the faith of Moses himself, as recorded in Hebrews 11. God kept this small, invisible core of faithful people alive, ensuring that the true faith persisted and that the prophetic line was maintained until the time of deliverance by Moses arrived.
So this entire 2,000-year span, from Abraham to the edge of the Exodus, culminates not just in the creation of a nation, but in the successful preservation of the true faith through repeated physical and spiritual crises.
The entire period served to establish the foundational structure of the church as a separate, designated nation carrying the promises, preparing them to receive the law, the specific ordinances, and the even clearer typological teachings that would follow under Moses.
Okay, let's try to bring this all together.
To synthesize the work of redemption during the Abrahamic age, God's strategy was marked by decisive action, the active separation of the seed from the corrupt world, the sealing and confirmation of the covenant with extreme clarity focused on faith, and the preparation of humanity through the simultaneous administration of sovereign mercy in preserving the few, and the stark terror of the law in judging the many. The light of the gospel shone progressively brighter, moving from a general concept to a specific, located, and timed hope for the Messiah.
And looking at this through the lens of Reformed theology, what is most striking is the clear demonstration of God's absolute sovereignty in preserving his elect church. Even when that visible church seemed corrupted, outnumbered, and physically exposed in Canaan or spiritually lost in Egypt, God upheld the faithful remnant.
Right.
And he did it through means, whether through the terror of fear or the miracle of multiplication, that had nothing to do with human purity or strength. This historical period is a vivid depiction of sovereign election and grace in action.
A fitting final reflection builds directly on the certainty of that sovereign scheduling we discussed earlier. Consider the implications of Jacob's prophecy that the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come. That statement was made thousands of years before the first century.
Think about the level of divine foreknowledge and control required to ensure that the political and jurisdictional conditions of one specific tribe, that they would retain some form of self-governance, but not ultimate kingship, would be precisely met just as the Messiah was to be born. It places a political clock on history, thousands of years in advance.
It does.
What does this breathtaking certainty reveal to you about the absolute reliability of God's revealed word and the precision with which his redemptive plan unfolds across all of history? That's something to carry with you until our next deep dive.